Welcome, brothers and sisters of the infinite. We are now in book 2, the second part of REN-SHEN Half Spirit. It's titled Agari. The Japanese word for east is Higashi, but the Ryukyu of Okinawa, in their own language, call it Agari. The word is cognate with Agaru in standard Japanese, which means rise. Just as the sun rises in the east, but everything rises in the east, including the sins of bloodlines which stain the world today. We are now reading chapter 6 of REN-SHEN Half Spirit, Triangles. Steve had lost his uncomplicated life and was desperate to leave all his personal tragedy behind. He was lucky he had relatives who helped him settle his father's estate matters. Some of the matters would take more time, but he was lucky there was an income stream which would assist him while he was training in Japan. He packed lightly. He was to be training after all. He spent more time narrowing down which of his taped music collection to bring than anything else. He had no idea what to expect, but was strangely optimistic about Japan. He was hopeful the time away would allow him to focus on his training and help ease the pain of his losses. The flight was uneventful, though Steve found it difficult to sleep. His mind kept returning to recent events. Nothing was normal about what he recently endured and learned, and it relentlessly played on his mind. Sleeping seemed to bring out the worst of his memories, and the noisy flight was not helping him relax. Tokyo was to be his first destination. Steve was eager to see Japan's capital before he settled into what he hoped would be a dedicated and uncomplicated life of training in Okinawa. It wasn't long before he landed at the new Narita airport in Tokyo and was making his way to the train station for Shinjuku. The brightest lights and tallest buildings were there, and Steve was eager to compare life in such a populous city with that of his quiet hometown of Adelaide in South Australia. It was winter back in Australia, and although the winters were mild back home, it was nice to feel the warm climate of Japan in the summer of 1988. The subway system gave him a gentle buffer before he reached the madness of Tokyo. Stepping out of the subway system into the heat of Shinjuku for the first time was a startling experience. The contrast with Steve's hometown was amazing. The feeling of space back home was replaced with dense crowds, bright lights and high-rise buildings. There was a sense of urgency about the city that Steve had never seen before. He was overwhelmed and excited in equal measure. Japan's economy had been thriving for decades, and by the late 1980s, it was a very expensive place to be. It wasn't easy for a foreigner in Japan. There was hardly any English to be seen, and although Steve had developed his conversational Japanese to a serviceable level, his knowledge of the writing systems was rudimental at best. Thankfully, he did his research before he left home, and he was sure his carefully marked map would help him find his hotel quickly. He wasn't going to stay there long, and was hoping to stay in Tokyo for a few days before making his way to Okinawa. The hotel was not far from Shinjuku Station. Steve calculated a 10-minute walk from the station to an area within Shinjuku called Kabukicho. It was a warm afternoon, and weaving through the swarms of people whilst holding his map and luggage was not easy. He couldn't seem to find a single spot where he wasn't in someone's way. He walked past some souvenir shops and saw the cute little Daruma dolls, like the one Sensei Mike gave him for good luck. He considered buying some for friends back home, but then he thought to himself, who knows when I'll go back? Maybe never. The little dolls can wait. Finally, the sweaty journey was over. He reached his hotel in just under 45 minutes. 10-minute walk, my ass, he thought to himself. Steve had never stayed in a hotel before. He wondered if all hotel rooms were as tiny as this. It didn't matter. There was a bed, and his exhaustion served him a dreamless sleep that was both welcome and invigorating. He woke a few hours later and quickly headed outside. He wasn't going to be in Tokyo for long. He needed to get out and see some of it. It was late in the evening and a hot, balmy night when Steve joined in the hordes of people on the streets in Shinjuku. He passed a 7-Eleven convenience store and made a mental note of its location for later. Then he passed other 7-Elevens and decided he could discard that memory safely. They were everywhere. Shinjuku, and in particular Kabukicho, was party central in Tokyo. People were clearly out for a good time. Drunk salarymen and girls were out in force. Club promoters were trying to drag Steve into their clubs, and he quickly developed a number of inoffensive responses to discourage their continued attention. He'd seen enough for one night and was heading back to the hotel when he decided to stop at a 7-Eleven for some water and a snack. He was walking through the Golden Gate precinct. Formerly known for its prostitution decades earlier, it had become a drinking area with numerous small establishments, full of people drinking and laughing the night away. As he passed an alley, he heard some shouting and stopped to look at what was happening. 3 men in suits were shouting at a short, stocky man who looked extremely drunk and shaky on his feet. He looked to be in his 40s and had his hair uncharacteristically fashioned in a ponytail. One of the men slapped the man and sent him sprawling to the ground. Then all 3 of the men in suits started to kick him repeatedly. Steve knew it was never wise to intervene in things he didn't understand. But he couldn't simply stand by and watch the man be kicked to death. He quickly ran there and grabbed the nearest man and flung him away from the action. He kicked the second guy with a perfectly executed side kick and sent him away. The third man saw what happened and raised his hand almost apologetically to Steve, bowed his head and walked away from the scene as though nothing had happened. Steve found the response rather perplexing, but quickly went to the aid of the man on the ground. He helped the man up and asked if he was okay. The man said he was fine and thanked Steve for helping him. His English was surprisingly quite good. He slurringly said to Steve, "Oh my Buddha, you kicked that man so well. Do you know karate?" Steve wasn't sure what to answer. He didn't feel like telling anyone about himself or what he knew about martial arts. And he found it odd those perfectly respectable looking gentlemen in suits felt compelled to beat the man. Shit, maybe this guy was the bad guy, Steve thought to himself. Steve told the man he had trained karate a little bit back home in Australia. The man said, "Oh, very excellent. I would love to hear everything about it. It would be very much my honour if you walk with me to my home so that I may practice my English a little longer." Steve didn't hear any alarm bells ringing in his mind and thought to himself, even if he is a criminal, he can't have a problem with me. I saved the poor bloke. Steve walked with the man to a building nearby and to his surprise noticed an English sign out front advertising karate classes. He saw at the bottom of the advertisement a note saying "Foreigners accepted." He noticed the actual Japanese writing and it was in fact Goju-Ryu karate that was being taught there. He thought he'd love to visit the dojo the following day to see how the Japanese people trained. At that moment the man coughed a little and gave a relieved sigh and said, "Here is my home." Steve asked, "Is this dojo where you live?" The drunk man looked a little embarrassed and slurred a little while he said, "Well, maybe I had another home before, but now I live inside my dojo where I teach my classes. It is very convenient and has a bathroom." Steve perhaps looked a little too surprised and asked, "Are you the sensei here?" The man dusted himself off, tucked his shirt into his pants, bowed and said, "I am Sensei Oshiro Takeshi. It is a pleasure to have made your acquaintance. You can call me Taki." Steve instinctively bowed, and as he had learned from Sensei Mike. He introduced himself formally in Japanese and said, "It would please me very much if you allowed me to attend one of your classes one day, Sensei Taki." Sensei Taki was taken aback with Steve's perfect self-introduction and said it would be his pleasure to have Steve attend. He asked Steve if he would like to come in for a tea, but Steve politely declined, saying it was very late and he should sleep. With that, they parted ways and Steve went straight back to his hotel. He forgot he was hungry earlier and went straight to sleep. It was not a good sleep. Again, Steve saw and heard the demon Hiro, and the terrible day was replayed over and over until he had to wake. He hadn't been exercising as frequently as before the tournament, but the dreams would see him wake up sweating profusely. He wondered if he was training harder than ever in his sleep. He didn't want to think about the dreams a moment longer, and he was starving. A visit to the nearby 7-Eleven soon opened up a world of delight for him. He found his amazing triangles of joy: tuna and mayonnaise onigiri, Small triangles of rice filled with tuna and mayonnaise, wrapped in seaweed. Steve tried one, then bought 2 more. He ate one of them and kept another for later. He'd never been so excited about triangles ever before in his life. They were heaven wrapped up in a triangle of seaweed, he thought to himself. He wanted to visit the nearby dojo, but he was eager to visit Shibuya. There was something he needed to see. The famous Hachiko, a statue in Shibuya dedicated to the memory of an Akita dog whose fame came from his loyalty to his owner. When his owner died, Hachiko would wait at the station for his master for a total of 9 years until his own death. He was finally laid to rest next to his master in 1935. The story captured Steve's imagination vividly, and he remembered his beloved dog, Tsare, Little King, and how much comfort he'd given Steve when his mother died. All the bittersweet childhood memories flooded back into his mind's eye. They quickly transformed into his more recent memories, and Steve again refused to allow himself to think about them. The statue was right next to the Shibuya station, and Steve found it quickly. It was inspiring to see. The dog was immortalized for nothing more than its loyalty and fidelity. He immersed himself in the moment and tried to remember everything about his beloved Tsare running to school to escort him back home every day in his youth. Steve enjoyed that memory and decided this was a perfect time to eat his last tuna and mayonnaise onigiri. The unwrapping of the snack was an extremely technical process for Steve. The potential for the triangle of rice to collapse was ever present. He made a mess of his first attempt. His second was much better, and he was completely committed to becoming a master in onigiri eating. He thought it would be nice to receive a black belt in onigiri eating. He would live a happy and uncomplicated life. He had almost finished unraveling his onigiri from its wrapping when he was bumped. His little triangle from heaven had fallen from his hands and disintegrated on the ground. Steve was crestfallen. He didn't even look to see who bumped him. He just stared at the ground, and his profound sadness was almost comical. A girl was apologizing to him profusely, and Steve was unable to drag his eyes away from his beloved fallen onigiri. The girl continued to apologize. She clearly saw Steve was a foreigner and proceeded to explain in English. "I am so sorry. I am carrying too many shopping bags, and I am so late. I am rushing for the train. I am so sorry." Steve finally looked up at her. She was strikingly beautiful. His triangle from heaven quickly became a distant and unimportant memory as Steve stumbled through an attempt at a response. He was hoping to sound relaxed about the incident and wanted to assure her that all was fine. Instead, he just pointed at the mess on the ground and murmured a few words. With a starry-eyed look at her. He'd never seen anyone so pretty in his life. Those beautiful eyes, he thought to himself. She was tall and slender and showing the deepest concern and empathy for Steve's loss. Finally, the joy of language returned to Steve, and he was able to string together a few coherent words. "No problem at all. Thank you very much," he said, wondering why he thanked her. He bent over to quickly collect the mess on the ground. She joined him and helped clean up. They managed to find a bin and throw away that once much-loved onigiri, and Steve asked her if she lived in Shibuya. She said, "No, I live in Shinjuku, but better shopping is here in Shibuya." Steve quickly replied, "Oh, I am staying in Shinjuku. Maybe we could..." She interjected, "Where are you staying in Shinjuku?" Steve told her the hotel name, and she quickly replied, "I am so very sorry again. I am so late. I must leave." And she ran to the station entrance. Steve did not dare look away from her. He wanted to remember everything about her. If she turned around to look at him, even for the slightest moment, he swore he would search all of Shinjuku, and indeed Japan, to find her. He watched her shrink smaller and smaller into the mass of commuters and maintained his singular focus on her, the girl of his dreams. She was no more than a speck at that stage, but she did it. She turned around and she looked right back at Steve and surrendered a tiny wave to him. Perhaps she was still feeling remorseful about the accident, or maybe she was simply being polite. Steve was a rational young man. He accepted both scenarios were quite reasonable conclusions. But he much preferred the third option, that she was promptly as madly in love and attracted to him as he was to her. If only he knew her name. Steve floated around Shibuya that afternoon. He didn't recall if his feet actually touched the ground for the rest of that day. He'd been enchanted by that girl and, for a welcome moment, was relieved of his burdens. His spirits were lifted and he decided to visit Sensei Taki at his dojo. The train system was so efficient and logical. Steve quickly found his way back to Shinjuku and the dojo. He decided to simply attend and not train. He was concerned his skills might not be good enough and was under the perception that all training in Japan was surely superior to anything outside of Japan. Even though Steve was confident nobody could be a better teacher than his sensei Mike, he still had a belief that the birthplace of karate would somehow be able to offer more insight to a dedicated karateka. Steve managed to catch the tail end of a training session in the dojo under the supervision of Sensei Taki. He soon learned he had nothing to feel inferior about. He saw mostly Japanese students at various grade levels perform the Sanchin kata. He thought to himself, Sensei Mike would never have allowed such a wasted and thoughtless movement. Sensei Taki was delighted Steve visited his dojo. His class had concluded and he invited Steve for a drink at the back of the dojo. He warmed some sake and poured Steve a drink and shouted, "Kanpai!" and encouraged Steve to drink. Out of politeness, Steve tasted it. He hated alcohol, and while the drink wasn't the worst thing he ever tasted, it most definitely wasn't anything he'd ever crave. Sensei Taki said, "Sake is my weakness. I love it. I also love beer, and to tell you truth, whiskey is also very favourable to me." As he poured himself and Steve another drink, Steve was already slightly drunk. He decided not to drink any more sake, but Sensei Taki was persuasive. He managed to coax Steve into yet another cup of sake. Steve felt so relaxed and enjoyed the easy conversation. Sensei Taki asked what he did that day and Steve jokingly shouted, "I fell in love today. I found my future wife in Shibuya. I don't know her name and I'm not sure I'll ever find her again, but I'm going to try my best." Sensei Taki's eyes widened. He enjoyed where the conversation was going and loved talking about girls. He said, "There are so many beautiful girls in Japan, so pretty. But I love Wonder Woman. You know, Linda Carter." Steve laughed. Wonder Woman was always on TV back home and he had an idea why Sensei Taki might have found her attractive. She was indeed a beautiful woman with large breasts, and Sensei Taki confirmed his infatuation as he gestured with his hands in front of his own chest. Steve became serious. He looked Sensei Taki in the eyes and said, "She was quite tall, with beautiful eyes. She had a dimple when she smiled and her voice was like a sweet dream. She said she lives in Shinjuku. Do you know her?" Sensei Taki laughed and said, "I think I know her, Steve-san." Steve optimistically leaned in closer with eager enthusiasm. Sensei Taki continued, "She is everywhere you look in Tokyo." Steve quickly reassured Sensei Taki there was only one girl like her in the world, and he would find her, no matter what. Sensei Taki then asked Steve what he thought of the training he saw earlier. Steve was indeed a little tipsy, but not stupid. He didn't want to upset his new friend. He said, "The students seem motivated and eager to please their sensei." Sensei Taki said, "No. They want to play the Nintendo and they do not have the true spirit for fighting. I think maybe you are being too kind to me. I should be a better sensei," as he slapped his own thigh. "Please come to the dojo and train with me tomorrow. I would like to see more of your skills, Steve-san. I know you can kick like a horse. I look very forward to seeing more," he said. It was another long day for Steve. Soon, he would leave for Okinawa. Somehow, he would try to find the girl of his dreams in Shinjuku. It was time to go back to his hotel. He thanked Sensei Taki for his hospitality and said good night. Sensei Taki changed out of his training gear and put on his shirt and trousers and said he would go to Golden Guy for a drink. Steve was astounded. He said, "Aren't you afraid of crossing paths with those men in the suits again?" Sensei Taki said, "They are low-level Yakuza criminals. I would never be afraid of such people," as he walked with Steve and started singing the theme song to the Wonder Woman TV series. Steve hadn't heard the word Yakuza since Sensei Mike talked about his history and crashed back to a reality he didn't want to hear about. He reminded Sensei Taki to be careful and stay out of the alleys. Steve worried about Sensei Taki all the way back to the hotel and and finally managed to swing his thoughts back to the nameless girl of his dreams as he laid down to rest in bed. Steve woke up with a thumping headache and decided if there was ever a question, then sake was most definitely not the answer. He drank copious amounts of water and ate 2 of his beloved onigiri and some Japanese omelette at the local 7-Eleven. He would train in the morning and try to sweat out the sake of the previous night. He wore his gi to the dojo but refrained from wearing his black belt. He thought it would be disrespectful to wear it. But he did bring his carefully packed certificate and letter from Sensei Mike in order to learn what Sensei Taki knew of Sensei Mike's teacher. Sensei Taki looked no worse for wear in the morning, Steve thought to himself. He looks as fresh as a daisy, for crying out loud. The class started and everything was surprisingly familiar to Steve. Other students kept looking over their shoulders at Steve's powerful movements. Sensei Taki asked Steve if he would like to perform his Sanchin kata. Steve had genuinely mastered the kata. He understood what it was like to dedicate an entire day to simply repeating the kata. It became a battle with oneself, and Steve had done it all before, many, many times. He performed the kata with a ferocity and spirit that nobody in that class had ever seen before. It was almost a religious experience for them. The entire dojo descended into a hush as the students watched Steve move through the sequence of movements. The energy was intense. Steve finished and some students even clapped. Sensei Taki ordered the class to leave immediately. Steve thought perhaps he did something inappropriate in the class. He asked Sensei Taki if he did something wrong, but Sensei Taki reassured him that was not the case. He said he needed to talk to him urgently and did not have the time to finish the class. Steve sat with Sensei Taki in the same little room they were drinking in the night before. Sensei Taki's normal jovial demeanour had changed into one of intense seriousness. He said, "You can only be from one of 2 lines. Who is your sensei? I demand you tell me." Steve turned and reached for his bag. Sensei Taki was faster than Steve could have possibly anticipated and had already placed a firm and deliberate hand on Steve's shoulder and another hand on his elbow to ensure control of his movement. He asked, "What are you reaching for, young Steve-san?" Steve said, "I have a letter from my sensei in Australia. I will show you." Steve sensed a danger that was non-existent at any other time since he had met Sensei Taki. Steve said, "I was hopeful you might know the sensei I'll be trying to locate in Okinawa. Here is the letter." Sensei Taki cautiously opened the envelope and looked at the letter. He read it, looked up at Steve, put it down, read it again. He then carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. He handed the letter back to Steve. He said, "Steve-san, I saw your true face when I saw your first movement. I saw your energy. Your presence dominated the dojo. I knew your line. I knew your teacher's teacher. I know you more than you do. I thought it could only be Mike or... Do not look at me now. I used to have what you have. I was successful here until the Yakuza burned me out of my home here. They hunt me all the way from Okinawa. I have not stopped drinking since then. Your sensei Mike is my older brother. I would do anything for him. He proved his honor to our sensei. You are family, Steve-san. Whatever you need, I am here to assist you. I ask you to stay here with me before you seek our sensei in Okinawa. The letter explains all I need to know about your skills, but there is much I can teach you about what your sensei Mike left behind when he left us in Okinawa. I want to know all about Mike. I hope he is well. Please stay for a while. Leave the hotel. Keep your money and stay with me." Steve didn't have the heart to tell Sensei Taki about Sensei Mike. He decided it was best to learn more from and about Sensei Taki before telling him anything about what happened on that terrible day. Steve could not believe how fate could have brought him to Sensei Taki. He thought about those triangles from heaven, the onigiri, and realized he may have found an even better triangle, the triangle from Australia to Shinjuku, which would guide him to Okinawa. He thought it would be wise to stay a little longer. He was eager to learn much about Sensei Mike from Sensei Taki, and would have a little more time to find the nameless girl of his dreams. He thanked Sensei Taki and decided he would check out of his hotel the following morning. Well, brothers and sisters of the infinite, did you see all that? He gets to Japan. Of all the coincidences, he finds a former student of the same sensei, or a student of the same sensei, that Sensei Mike had. This girl that he saw, he fell in love instantly. Perhaps we might see her again. Who knows? Hang in there, we'll find out. Interesting, Japan in the late 80s had gone through massive growth economically. It was one of the most expensive countries to visit during that era, through to the 90s as well, of course. The economic expansion was going crazy. In fact, by the late 80s, they kind of almost outpriced themselves out of the market. You know, your cheap little Honda or Toyota from the 1970s started getting quite expensive and competing with, you know, German car prices, you know, perhaps a little bit cheaper, to the point where people might think, you know what, I might pay more for a German car. But the Japanese ones were made very well. They were great quality. So, and the same went for a whole bunch of, you know, Japanese manufactured items. Economically, the nation was starting to grind to a bit of a halt. It actually started to outprice itself out of the market. The cost of wages there was ever increasing, so it became an expensive country. We learned that that Sensei Taki, an interesting fellow, ponytail, stocky guy, shortish, loved Wonder Woman for some reason, 2 reasons perhaps, had the same teacher, was now living in his own dojo. Very odd. Surely that's a terrible sort of outcome for a man to admit. It's interesting. I recall reading about a Japanese fellow who was asked once whether he had any pets. And he said, maybe I have a cat. So it's quite a bizarre response. But when you understand Japanese culture a little bit, it's actually quite nice, quite pleasing to hear that. Because in fact, what he was trying to say was, my cat died. I don't want to tell you my cat's dead. It's going to upset you. So maybe I had a cat. So Sensei Taki maybe lived elsewhere before. But in fact, then he got burnt out of there. When they had a bit more of a heart-to-heart after a few drinks, Sensei Taki revealed that information. And in fact, in the 80s, the Yakuza were burning people out of major apartment buildings. And then building nice, shiny new hotels and other developments. And this was quite a thing in the 80s. So I thought I'd put that in. It's actually quite a real scenario that occurred, particularly around the region we're talking about, Shinjuku, Kabukicho. So very much a reality. So that's just trying to inject a bit of reality into our story, which hopefully clings to reality more often than not. He met that beautiful girl. I think we might see her again. You know, when you fall in love that hard, you're just going to keep searching, aren't you? Surely. From one little chance meeting, maybe. I think we will. Hopefully we catch up with her. I think we've dealt with that chapter enough. There wasn't too much to discuss, but it gets interesting. We're in Japan. It's a place where they believe in their demons and their gods. Very old cultures always do, and there's often significant meaning attached to traditions. Sometimes you've forgotten the original purpose, but the traditions continue. And Japan is full of that, just traditions that just enduring. So come travel to Japan with me in this book. I hope you enjoyed that chapter. We've got more to come. We are definitely in book 2 now, the second of 3 parts of REN-SHEN Half Spirit. Much more to come. Stay tuned. Please subscribe. I'm thrilled with your input. I'm receiving emails. I enjoy the communication. I'm loving the reviews of the book. So thank you, anyone who's reviewed it online. If you haven't, please, the reviews really help me. If you're enjoying these talks, please buy the book as well. That's the only way I'm making money. I'm not begging for money any other way, but I really would appreciate it if you buy the book, if you haven't already. If you bought the book and enjoyed it, please buy it for someone else. That's a wonderful gift. You'll know the people that like it. Chances are they like martial arts. Chances are they might need a pleasant distraction in their life, and I think they'll enjoy the book anyway. So thank you for your support. I really appreciate it. See you very soon.